I've never really been the type to get scared being alone at night. Honestly, I kind of like it. It's quiet, peaceful, and most of the time, it feels like the world's finally slowed down. Usually it's just me, my TV, and maybe a snack or two. That's how it was last night, at least at first. I was sprawled out on the couch, binge-watching some random movie I barely paid attention to. The clock said 1:30 a.m., but I wasn't even tired. It was one of those nights where you're wide awake for no reason. Suddenly, I heard a sound. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was just one of those usual house noises. My place is old, and it creaks sometimes, especially at night when everything's dead silent. But this noise wasn't the usual creak or groan. It was a knock, not the polite kind either, more like a slow, heavy knock. At first, I thought maybe I'd imagined it. You know how sometimes your mind plays tricks when you're tired? But then it came again, 3 steady knocks like someone was standing right at my front door. I hit pause on the movie and sat there for a second, just listening. I didn't move right away. I mean, who knocks on a door at 1:30 in the morning? Maybe they had the wrong house or something. That thought crossed my mind, but it didn't explain why I suddenly felt my skin crawl. My living room was dimly lit, only the TV glowing in the background, and the air felt heavier than it should have. I didn't like it. Still, I wasn't about to jump to conclusions. I live in a pretty safe neighborhood, and weird stuff like this doesn't happen here. So I got up, grabbed my phone just in case, and tiptoed toward the door. The knocking had stopped by now, but my heart was pounding like it hadn't. The hallway leading to the door seemed longer than usual, like every step took more effort than it should have. I stood in front of the door for a moment, staring at it. The silence felt louder than the knocks. I leaned in, almost pressing my ear against the wood, trying to hear if there was anyone out there. I didn't want to open it, not yet. So I looked through the peephole instead, expecting maybe a confused delivery guy or one of my neighbors, but nothing. There was no one there. The street outside looked completely empty. Just my quiet neighborhood under the dim streetlights, the trees barely moving in the breeze. No cars passing by, no figures lingering outside. It was like the world had paused right outside my door. For a second, I felt relieved. Maybe I had imagined it after all. But then I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. This time, I didn't even look through the peephole. I just froze. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was definitely at my door. But how could they knock and not be there? I took a step back, suddenly unsure if I wanted to know what was going on. My pulse quickened, and for the first time in years, I felt a real sense of fear creeping in. Something was off. The whole situation felt wrong. I stood there, trying to figure out my next move. Was I overreacting? Should I just open the door, see if someone was playing a prank? But who would be out there at this time, and why? Every logical thought told me to calm down, that I was being paranoid. But deep down, I knew this wasn't normal. My hand hovered over the doorknob, my heart pounding so hard it was practically echoing in my ears. I didn't want to be the person who opens the door and regrets it, but I also didn't want to sit there and do nothing. After a few seconds, I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and slowly unlocked the door. With a knife-like tension in my chest, I pulled it open just a crack, enough to peek out. Again, nothing. Not a single person. Not a shadow. Just the cold night air and an empty porch. I stepped outside a little, looking around the yard. Down the street, still nothing. No footprints, no sign anyone had been there. The breeze picked up, brushing past me like a whisper, making me shiver even though it wasn't that cold. The only strange thing? My porch light, the one that automatically flicks on when it detects movement, was off. Weird. I just changed the bulb last week, and it worked fine earlier in the evening. I stood there for a moment longer, my hand tightening around the door handle. My gut told me to close it, lock it, and forget this ever happened. But the curiosity gnawed at me. Who had knocked? And why couldn't I see them? I glanced around one last time, my eyes darting to every corner. But no matter how hard I looked, the answer just wasn't there. I went back inside, locking the door behind me and making sure the chain was on this time. I returned to the couch, tried to shake off the weird feeling in my chest. I told myself it was probably nothing, just a prank or maybe a neighbor messing around. But as I sat back down, I couldn't relax. The house felt different now, like it was watching me, waiting, I grabbed the remote, trying to focus on the movie again. The voices on the screen sounded distant, like I wasn't really hearing them. And then just when I thought things were settling down, the knock came again. 3 slow, heavy knocks that seemed to echo through the whole house. I froze on the couch, the sound of the knock still echoing in my head. I had just checked. There was nobody out there. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat making me more aware of how dead silent the house had become. No sound from outside, no wind, nothing. Just those knocks. I stared at the door, almost daring it to happen again. But the silence was even worse now that I knew it wasn't in my head. Someone or something was knocking at my door, and I couldn't explain it. I stood up slowly, trying to shake off the chills running down my spine. Maybe I had missed something earlier. Maybe someone was there, but had hidden by the time I opened the door. The thought seemed ridiculous, but my brain was scrambling for any rational explanation. People don't just disappear into thin air. The knocking didn't come again, but I still felt like I had to do something. I grabbed my phone off the coffee table, checking it out of instinct. But of course, I had no messages, no missed calls. No one was trying to get in touch with me, which only made me feel more isolated in that moment. I walked back to the door, this time with more caution. My fingers hovered over the doorknob, hesitating. I wasn't sure if I wanted to look out again. What if I saw something I couldn't explain? Or worse, what if I saw nothing at all? I exhaled sharply, trying to get a grip on my nerves. This was stupid. There had to be an explanation, and I wasn't going to solve anything by just standing there, scared. I looked through the peephole again, my breath catching in my throat as I did. It was the same as before. Nothing. No figures. No shadows. No signs of life outside. The street was completely empty. I stepped back from the door, my mind racing. How could I hear knocking so clearly and there be no one out there? Something caught my attention. The porch light. It was still off. I had definitely noticed it earlier, and it bothered me. My light works on a motion sensor, so it should have turned on when I opened the door. But it stayed dark, like something had messed with it. I glanced up at the ceiling light inside my house. It was working fine. Only the porch light seemed to be out, and that only made me feel more unsettled. I don't know what pushed me, maybe frustration, but I unlocked the door again a little quicker this time. I opened it all the way, the night air rushing in and instantly making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stepped out onto the porch, looking around. It felt like I was being watched, even though I couldn't see anyone. I checked to my left, to my right, even craned my neck around the corner of the house. Still no one. The street remained eerily quiet, almost too quiet for a neighborhood where you usually heard dogs barking or the occasional car passing by. I stepped down from the porch and walked a few feet onto the lawn. My porch light flickered briefly, then blinked out completely. Great. I'd have to deal with that later, but right now, the whole scene felt wrong, like I was standing in a place I didn't belong. I found myself glancing at the neighbor's house next door. The porch light was on over there, shining bright, almost mocking me for the eerie darkness that now surrounded my house. I stood there for a while, just trying to figure out what to do. My mind kept bouncing back and forth. Was this just some prank, or was something worse happening? I couldn't tell, but as I turned to head back inside, I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. This time, the sound came from inside the house. I froze. It couldn't be. There was no one else inside, no one who could have possibly gotten in. My heart raced as the realization hit me. The knocks weren't coming from the door anymore. They were coming from somewhere deeper in the house. For a second, I thought about running. I could go next door, pound on Jake's door, wake him up. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the disbelief. Maybe it was the stubborn part of me that refused to admit I was scared. Instead of running, I closed the front door behind me, locking it again, this time more out of habit than anything else. I stood in the foyer, listening intently. The house was still. Too still. I gripped the edge of the wall, my knuckles white as I waited for the noise to come again. The knocks had sounded like they were coming from somewhere upstairs. I don't know why, but the silence after the knocks was even more terrifying. It's like the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a move. My eyes darted toward the staircase at the back of the hallway. I couldn't see anything up there, but I felt it, that heavy sense of being watched. The air seemed thicker as I took a cautious step toward the stairs. my heart hammering in my chest. "Hello!" I called out, my voice sounding shaky even though I tried to sound tough. There was no response, but I didn't expect one. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was up there. I needed to check, if only to prove to myself that I was just being paranoid. I made my way slowly to the stairs, each step creaking louder than usual, like the house was warning me not to go any further. The closer I got to the top, the more my mind started playing tricks on me. What if I opened my bedroom door and someone or something was waiting for me? I could almost picture it, the shadow in the corner, the silent figure lurking just out of sight. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, my whole body was tense, and I realized I was gripping my phone so tightly that my fingers hurt. I stood there for a second, staring at the closed door to my room. The house was so quiet that I could hear my own breathing, fast and uneven. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. I could do this. I had to do this. I reached for the doorknob, my hand shaking slightly as I gripped it. For a moment, I just stood there frozen, unsure of whether I should turn it and see what was inside or run downstairs and pretend none of this had happened. And then, just as I was about to open the door, the knocking started again. But this time, it wasn't coming from upstairs. I froze at the top of the stairs, the door to my bedroom just inches away. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but now the knocking wasn't coming from up here, it was downstairs. It echoed through the house, louder and more persistent than before. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. How could the sound have moved? How could someone be knocking downstairs when I had just been there moments ago and saw nothing? Every instinct told me to stay put, but I couldn't just stand there forever. The knocks were rhythmic, deliberate, like someone or something wanted me to come back down. My stomach twisted in knots. I hadn't seen anyone outside. No one was at the door when I checked. But now, the knocks felt closer, more invasive, like they were creeping through the walls themselves. I swallowed hard, trying to get my breathing under control. My heartbeat was loud in my ears, a constant reminder of how scared I actually was. It felt like I was stuck in some kind of loop, hearing the knocks over and over, no matter where I went. I slowly backed away from my bedroom door, not taking my eyes off it. A part of me was still convinced that something was in there, hiding, waiting, but the knocking downstairs demanded my attention. I had to know what was happening. I had to go back down. I forced myself to descend the stairs, each step feeling like a weight pulling me further into whatever was unfolding inside my own home. The knocking stopped just as I reached the bottom of the staircase, leaving me in complete, suffocating silence. I stood there for a moment, listening, waiting for the next sound. My living room was dimly lit from the TV screen, casting flickers of light across the walls. The house felt different, like it wasn't mine anymore, like it had shifted somehow. I edged closer to the front door, half expecting to hear another knock or see some shadowy figure standing on the other side. But instead, everything remained still. I glanced around the room, every shadow suddenly seeming more sinister, more alive. The silence was making my imagination run wild. Then I heard it again, the footsteps. But this time, they weren't just random sounds. They were deliberate, slow, and they were coming from upstairs. I felt my blood run cold. No one should have been up there. I had just come from there, and the house was empty. Or at least, I thought it was. But now, someone or something was moving around above me. The sound of the footsteps was unmistakable, like someone pacing back and forth in my bedroom. I didn't want to go back upstairs. Every part of me screamed to leave, to get out of the house, but something about the footsteps, the steady pacing, held me there. Maybe it was the way they seemed so human, so normal, like someone was simply waiting for me to come back. Maybe it was curiosity, the same kind that got me this far, that made me want to know the truth, even if it was terrifying. I clenched my fists, trying to shake off the fear. I couldn't just stand here and let whatever this was play games with me. I needed to figure it out, and fast. Grabbing a kitchen knife from the counter, I felt a slight comfort in holding something, anything, that might give me a sense of control. The metal felt cool and solid in my hand, a small reassurance in the midst of chaos. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound strong. The words hung in the air, unanswered, making the silence even more oppressive. My pulse quickened as I realized how absurd it was to expect a response. Whoever or whatever was upstairs wasn't going to answer me. I took a few steps toward the stairs, knife in hand, and paused. The footsteps had stopped again, as if they were waiting for me to make the first move. The tension was unbearable. Every inch of my body was screaming at me to just get out of the house, to run, but I couldn't leave without knowing. I had to face whatever was up there. My foot hit the first step, and it creaked under my weight. The sound echoed through the house, louder than it should have been, and I winced. As I climbed the stairs, each creak felt like a countdown to something inevitable. The closer I got to the top, the more I realized that I wasn't just afraid of the footsteps. I was afraid of what I would find when I reached my bedroom door again. Halfway up the stairs, I stopped and listened. The footsteps were gone, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible hum. It wasn't coming from my bedroom anymore. It was coming from the hallway, just beyond the stairs. My skin prickled as I realized the sound was closer than I thought. The knife felt heavier in my hand as I gripped it tighter, trying to steady myself. I reached the top of the stairs and turned toward the hallway. The door to my bedroom was still closed, just like I had left it, but now there was something else. A shadow. It stretched along the hallway floor, faint but unmistakable, as if someone was standing just out of view, waiting for me to come closer. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. I took a step forward, the shadow not moving, not shifting, just there, looming. I couldn't see what was casting it, but it was there right around the corner. My heart pounded harder, and my legs felt weak, but I forced myself to move. Another step, and then another. Suddenly, the humming stopped. The shadow shifted, just slightly, like whoever it belonged to had moved. My pulse raced, but I knew I couldn't stop now. I was so close. I had to see it. I had to know. I stepped into the hallway, knife at the ready, and turned the corner. But the hallway was empty. There was no one there. No shadow, no figure, nothing. Just the same darkened space I had walked through 100 times before. I stood there, staring into the emptiness, my mind struggling to catch up with what my eyes were telling me. How could there be nothing? I had seen the shadow, felt the presence of someone. Yet here I was standing in an empty hallway, holding a knife like a fool. The silence returned, heavier than ever, pressing down on me as I lowered the knife. The footsteps, the knocking, the shadow. It all seemed to disappear the moment I stepped into the hallway. But something still felt wrong. I wasn't alone. I couldn't be. I stood there in the empty hallway, my heart racing, trying to understand what had just happened. The shadow was gone. The footsteps had stopped. But that uneasy feeling still gripped me, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something else to happen. My grip on the knife tightened. I wasn't ready to let go of it yet. Whatever was going on, it didn't feel like it was over. I glanced back toward my bedroom door, which was still closed. That was where the footsteps had come from originally, where I'd seen the shadow moving under the door. I didn't know if I had the nerve to open it now, but I couldn't stand there, frozen either. I had to figure out what was going on in my own house. My legs felt like they were weighed down, but I forced them to move one slow step after another until I was standing right in front of the door. I stood there, staring at the doorknob, my hand hovering over it. My reflection in the metal was distorted, stretched, almost like I wasn't fully myself anymore. My pulse was thudding in my ears, the silence around me making every breath feel too loud. I needed to just get it over with. I needed to see what was behind the door. I gritted my teeth and twisted the doorknob, pushing the door open with a creak that felt louder than it should have been. The light from the hallway spilled into the room, casting strange shadows across the floor. I stepped inside, half expecting something or someone to jump out at me, but the room was empty, just like the hallway. My bed was untouched, my desk exactly where I had left it. Everything was in its place. There were no signs of anything or anyone being in there. But I knew what I'd heard. I knew what I'd seen. That shadow, those footsteps, they weren't just in my head. I scanned the room, my eyes darting from corner to corner, looking for something, anything, out of the ordinary. But everything seemed fine. The window was closed, the curtains slightly drawn. I walked over to the window and peeked through the gap in the curtains. The street outside was just as empty as it had been earlier. No one was out there. No movement. Just a quiet night. I turned away from the window, frustration bubbling up inside me. I didn't understand. How could I have heard and seen so much? And yet there was no sign of anything happening. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. Maybe the exhaustion was catching up with me, playing tricks on me. But it didn't feel like that. It felt real, too real. Just as I was about to leave the room, I heard it again. A noise. But this time, it wasn't knocking. It was quieter, like a soft scraping sound, almost too faint to notice. I froze, listening closely. The noise was coming from the closet. I turned toward it slowly, dread creeping up my spine. The closet door was slightly ajar, the darkness behind it deeper than the shadows in the room. My mouth went dry as I realized that, this whole time, I hadn't checked the closet. I hadn't even thought about it. But now, the noise was unmistakable. Someone or something was in there. For a second, I considered leaving, running, getting out of the house, and never looking back. But I knew I couldn't. This was my home. I couldn't just leave without knowing what was in that closet. I stepped closer, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. Every inch of me screamed to stop, but I couldn't. I reached out and grabbed the edge of the door, pulling it open the rest of the way. Inside, the closet was dark, filled with the usual clutter, clothes, boxes, random things I hadn't bothered to organize. But there was something else too. At the back of the closet, just barely visible in the faint light from the room, was a figure. A person crouched low, facing the wall. My breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't react to me. They just sat there, as if they hadn't noticed I'd opened the door. My mind raced. Who the hell was this? How had they gotten into my house? Who are you? I asked, my voice shaky, but louder than I meant it to be. The figure didn't respond. I could hear my pulse thumping in my ears, drowning out the silence. I took a step back, gripping the knife tighter, but the figure remained still. The shadows in the closet made it hard to make out any details, but I could tell it wasn't just a pile of clothes or boxes. It was a person. Hey, I yelled, louder this time, trying to force some courage into my voice. I asked you a question. Slowly, so slowly it made my skin crawl, the figure began to move. It didn't stand up, didn't turn around fully. Instead, it twisted its head, just enough for me to see part of its face. But what I saw didn't make sense. The face was wrong. It wasn't just dark from the shadows. It looked distorted, twisted in a way that didn't seem human. I stumbled back, my legs shaking. The figure turned a little more, and I saw it, the eyes. They weren't normal. They were hollow, empty, like they were staring through me instead of at me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just stood there, frozen, watching as the figure slowly stood up. It was tall, taller than I expected, its limbs stretching unnaturally as it unfolded itself from the cramped space in the closet. The silence in the room felt suffocating, like the air had been sucked out. And then, without a sound, the figure stepped toward me. I snapped out of my frozen state, my instincts kicking in. I turned and bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest as I stumbled into the hallway. My mind was screaming at me to get out, to run, but my legs felt heavy, uncooperative, like they were stuck in quicksand. I threw a glance over my shoulder, expecting the figure to be right behind me, but the hallway was empty. I didn't wait for an explanation. I ran downstairs, gripping the railing so hard my knuckles turned white. The walls seemed to close in around me, the darkness of the house swallowing me whole as I reached the bottom of the stairs. I burst into the living room, panting, the knife still clutched tightly in my hand. My mind was racing, trying to process what I had just seen. Was I hallucinating? Was any of this real? And then, just as I reached the front door, I heard the knocking again. But this time it wasn't coming from outside. I was halfway to the front door when I heard the knocking again. This time, though, it didn't come from the door. It was behind me, somewhere inside the house. My entire body went rigid, every hair on the back of my neck standing up. It couldn't be happening. There was no way the knocking could be inside. But it was clear, deliberate, and coming from somewhere in the house. I spun around, my heart pounding in my ears, but there was nothing. No figure, No shadow, just the dim glow of the living room. The flicker from the TV casting unsettling shapes across the walls. My hand tightened around the doorknob, ready to fling the door open and run, but something held me in place. The knocking had changed. It wasn't random now, it was steady, rhythmic, like it was counting down. Knock, knock, knock. I swallowed hard, feeling sweat drip down my back. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. I was gripping the knife so tightly that my hand hurt, but I couldn't bring myself to relax. The silence after the knocks was crushing, like the house itself was pressing down on me, waiting for me to react. I knew I should leave, run to a neighbor's house, call the police, something, anything but standing there, frozen in place, waiting for whatever was about to happen next. But then something caught my eye. A message, scrawled in thick, dark letters across the window in the living room. I blinked, my heart skipping a beat. The window had been clear just moments ago. I hadn't heard anything or anyone come in, yet there it was, plain as day. I see you. The letters were smeared, like someone had dragged their fingers through the dust or fog on the glass. They glistened slightly, still fresh. My breath hitched as I stared at the words. They weren't just a warning, they were a declaration. Whoever or whatever had been knocking had been watching me the whole time. My blood ran cold. I stumbled back, almost tripping over my own feet, my eyes darting around the room. Was someone inside? How had they written that without me noticing? I hadn't taken my eyes off the windows or doors. I would have heard something, wouldn't I? Panic surged through me. I needed to get out. Now! I turned back toward the door, reaching for the lock, but as soon as my fingers touched the latch, I felt it, an overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone anymore. The air grew thick, oppressive, like someone was standing right behind me, breathing down my neck. I froze, too terrified to look back. My hand hovered over the lock, my mind screaming at me to just open the door and run. But something held me there. The presence behind me was heavy, almost suffocating, like I could feel its gaze boring into my back. I was trapped, cornered in my own house, and I didn't even know by what. Forcing myself to move, I turned my head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of the reflection in the glass of the door. What I saw made my heart stop. In the reflection, standing just a few feet behind me, was a figure. Tall, shadowy, with features I couldn't quite make out. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there watching me. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, were dark, hollow, like pits of nothingness. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The air around it seemed to ripple, distorting the space, like it was somehow bending reality just by being there. I gasped, stumbling backward, my back hitting the wall hard. The reflection flickered, and when I looked again, it was gone. Just like that, the figure vanished, leaving only the chilling silence in its wake. My heart raced as I struggled to catch my breath. I wasn't imagining this. I couldn't be. But before I could make sense of what had just happened, my phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking the heavy quiet. I fumbled for it, my hands shaking as I unlocked the screen. There was a new message. At first, I didn't recognize the number. No contact, no name, just a blank number at the top of the screen. I stared at the message for a second, too stunned to react. Don't look in the mirror. My stomach dropped. My hand clenched around the phone as the words sank in. Someone knows something was messing with me. It knew I was afraid. It was playing with me, pushing me, and now it was giving me instructions. But why? I looked around, my eyes landing on the mirror across the room, the one hanging just above the fireplace. I hadn't even thought about it until now. My reflection stared back at me, distorted slightly in the dim light. But it was just me, just my terrified, wide-eyed face, and the empty room behind me. But the message, what did it mean? Don't look in the mirror? Why not? What would happen if I did? I tore my eyes away from the mirror, panic bubbling in my chest. I couldn't stay here. This wasn't some prank. This wasn't just my imagination. It was real, and it was happening. I had to get out, but the door felt miles away, and the presence that had been behind me moments ago seemed to linger in the corners of the room, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I edged toward the door, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Every step felt like a risk, like something was going to spring out at me at any second. The message on the window, the figure in the reflection, the buzzing phone, it all pointed to one terrifying truth. I wasn't alone. And whatever was in my house wasn't going to let me leave easily. My fingers wrapped around the doorknob, and just as I began to turn it, I heard it again. That soft, scraping sound. It wasn't knocking this time, it was something else. Something closer. Something inside. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I yanked the door open and bolted outside, the cool night air hitting me like a shock. I ran down the steps and into the yard, not looking back. My lungs burned as I sprinted, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. But one thing was clear. Whatever was in my house wasn't finished with me yet. I didn't stop running until I was halfway across the yard, gasping for air and trying to make sense of everything. My legs felt like jelly, my chest heaving as I stood there, panting under the dim glow of the streetlights. My mind was spinning, flashing between the figure I saw in the reflection, the message on the window, and the warning text on my phone. I glanced over at my neighbor's house, Jake's place, just a few yards away. His porch light was off. The whole house was dark. I'd usually hear his dog barking if anyone even walked near our street, but tonight there was nothing, just dead silence. It was like the whole neighborhood had fallen into some eerie, unnatural quiet. I turned back toward my house, half expecting to see that figure watching me from the doorway, but everything was still. The windows were dark, the door closed behind me. There was no sign of anything, but I knew better now. It wasn't gone. It was inside, waiting. I took a few shaky steps toward Jake's house, figuring I could at least bang on his door, wake him up, get someone else involved. But something made me stop. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in my house was somehow tied to me, that if I brought anyone else into it, it would make things worse. The thought sent a chill down my spine, but deep down, I knew I had to face this on my own. No one else could help me now. My phone buzzed in my pocket again, making me jump. I fumbled for it, my fingers trembling as I looked at the screen. Another message from the same unknown number. Come back inside. I stared at the words, my pulse hammering in my ears. It was toying with me, daring me to return. Part of me wanted to chuck the phone, to run, and never look back, but the rest of me was tired. Tired of being scared. Tired of being hunted by something I didn't understand. I needed answers. Without really thinking, I turned and started walking back toward the house. Every step felt heavier, like I was marching towards something inevitable, something I couldn't avoid anymore. The air felt thick, the world around me muted, like I was walking through a dream I couldn't wake up from. The closer I got to the house, the more the dread settled in my gut, but I kept going. I had to know the truth. I reached the front door, hesitating for a moment, before gripping the doorknob and pushing it open. The house was exactly as I'd left it. Dark, quiet, but now the silence wasn't just unsettling, it was oppressive. The atmosphere inside felt wrong, like the very walls were alive, watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. The message on the window was still there, the words smeared and faint, but unmistakable. I see you. I swallowed hard, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just shadows. The scraping noise came again, faint but clear, coming from somewhere deeper inside the house. It was the same sound I'd heard before, like something sharp dragging across the floor. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I took a few cautious steps forward, following the sound. My grip tightened on the knife, my knuckles white. I didn't know what I was about to face, but I wasn't going to run this time. The sound led me to the hallway, the same one where I'd seen the shadow earlier. The air was colder here, almost freezing, and the further I went, the more I could feel it, that presence. It was like walking into a wall of pressure, something thick and suffocating. I reached the stairs, my legs trembling as I looked up into the darkness above me. Suddenly, I heard a voice, low, whispering, barely audible, but it sent a jolt of fear through me. It wasn't coming from upstairs, it was right behind me. Don't run, it whispered, the words brushing against the back of my neck like a cold wind. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but the hallway was empty. No one was there. The voice hadn't sounded human. It was like it had come from all around me, not from any specific direction. My stomach twisted with fear, but I couldn't run. Not now. I took a deep breath and turned back to the stairs. The scraping sound started again, louder this time, coming from the top of the staircase. Whatever was up there was waiting for me, calling me closer. I couldn't avoid it anymore. This was the moment I had been dreading since the first knock. I climbed the stairs slowly, each creak of the wood beneath my feet echoing through the house. The darkness seemed to press in on me, swallowing the faint light from the hallway below. By the time I reached the top, my entire body was shaking, but I forced myself to keep moving. The door to my bedroom was open now, just a crack. I hadn't left it like that. I stepped forward, my breath shallow, and pushed the door open with the tip of the knife. The room was dark, except for a small sliver of light spilling in from the hallway. My bed was just as I'd left it, my clothes still scattered on the chair in the corner. But there was something else, something wrong. A figure stood in the far corner of the room, its back to me, tall, thin, its outline barely visible in the shadows. My heart pounded as I stared at it, unable to move. The figure didn't turn around, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its eyes on me. Even with its back turned, I knew it was watching me. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand answers, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, the figure moved just slightly, its head tilting to the side, as if it was listening for something. That's when I noticed the mirror, the one above my dresser, reflecting the entire room. In the reflection, I could see myself standing there, knife in hand, staring at the figure. But the reflection wasn't right. The figure in the mirror wasn't facing away. It was facing me, staring directly at me with hollow, empty eyes. And then it smiled. I stumbled back, my pulse racing, the knife slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The figure in the corner didn't move, but its reflection, my reflection, was grinning, its lips twisting into an unnatural, eerie smile. I couldn't breathe. The reflection took a step forward, but the figure in the room stayed still. I was paralyzed, caught between reality and whatever nightmare I had stumbled into. The reflection leaned closer, its hollow eyes locking onto mine, and whispered the same words I had heard earlier. "Don't run." In that moment, I realized something horrifying. The reflection wasn't mimicking me. It wasn't following my movements. It wasn't me at all. It was something else, something that had been watching me all along. And then, the room went dark.